Hello everyone, this is Professor Reha and welcome back to the class examinations. This one is the Warder, specifically the Soldier-Shaman combination. Now this is a fairly interesting combination in that it is fairly similar. There's not a whole lot of different ways you can really effectively play this without using certain pieces of equipment. So let's hop right into this. Now, first off, the two classes share a certain amount of bleeding and internal trauma and physical damage. There is a rather substantial emphasis on these damage types overall. And this is actually what I would describe as one of the few really excellent hybrid player pet build, because you can go into Primal Bond, increase your physical, internal trauma, and bleeding damage, which is great, and also boost your pets. Now, this particular class only has two pets, admittedly. The Summon Briarthorn, obviously, and what is fairly interesting is that even though you have Emboldened Presence, which is nice and all, whether or not you use it. Now, keep in mind, and this is something that not a lot of people think about, not a lot of people really sit down and actually talk about, Emboldening Presence boosts you too. You gain these benefits just as much as any of your pets do. So if you want to go into Emboldening Presence, it's not a bad idea, especially if you want to splash some retaliation damage in there. But it's not necessary for this particular combination. But Primal Bond, if you want to go with pets and still do some pretty impressive damage, Primal Bond is great. You get some damage absorption, bleeding, physical, internal trauma. This makes the Blade Arc slash Laceration. This makes this absolutely fantastic. This makes Cadence really great. And if you are going to, because obviously you do have the bleeding damage, you have the physical damage here. Now, a thing to note, this is very important to note, is that if you are going to go into the Primal Bond build, then, well, you don't necessarily have to use Laceration. If you are going to be using an attack boost, you are going to want to go into Cadence over Savagery, because Savagery does not really do so much physical damage. It does some here, but that's just increasing whatever physical damage your weapon happens to be doing, because there is no physical damage attached at this point. So, that being said, additionally, Primal Bond does not increase the lightning damage. So if you are going to go with a Primal Bond combination, strong use, strong pets, and you're going to use Primal Bond for this, that's fine. It's a great it's a great build. It's really fun to play. It's very interesting to play. But if you're going to go into this, don't use Savagery. Use Cadence. Cadence eventually just gains all the benefits to take advantage of the Primal Bond boosts, whereas Savagery doesn't gain, or doesn't provide as many of those damage types. So, word of warning there. If you are going to be going into Stormcaller's Pact, there is extremely little that you're going to be pulling from Soldier. You will be pulling, and here's Will, for the healing, Military Conditioning, possibly Veterancy, possibly Decorated Soldier. Decorated Soldier is actually... let me talk about this for a second. Decorated Soldier is one skill that you should always consider adding to this combination. Now, I don't necessarily always say, hey, this is fantastic, There's usually about 3 skills per combination that I'll sit and say, yeah, you should always consider these. Decorated Soldier is one of those for this combination. Another one for this combination is, in fact, Brute Force, because this will give you, regardless of what kind of build you're going for, this will give you some really great damage. This gives you a little bit of attack damage conversion, which is really nice. And even if, whether you're using Primal Bond, Stormcaller's Pact, or if you even want to use Olorin's Rage, this is fantastic. Now you are thinking to yourself, but this means you're basically very strongly recommending we use two-handed weapons. No, but it's always at least seriously worth considering with this combination. You ultimately don't have to, but at least seriously think about it. Hey, I'm going with a directed improv. Do I want to use brute force? It's a great skill, locks me into two-handed. Do I want to use two-handed? Do I feel like two-handed? Do I want to use a shield? Do I want to try an offhand with this combination? You can do whatever you want, but brute force is, at the very least, something you should consider, even, at least until you decide what kind of weapon you want your build to use. The only other thing that I would really strongly recommend would be Grasping Vines, for the very similar reason as brute force. Regardless of which way you decide to go, this is going to be fairly good damage. Less so with the Stormcaller's Pact, but it can take a lot of advantage of the physical damage boosts of everything else. Obviously, you have Menhir's Will being used with shields or two-handed melee weapons, so that's fine either way. But Entangling Vines also is very effective for a Retail build if you wanted to go with that. But yes, essentially what this particular class combination is going to break down into is asking yourself the question, do I want to run pets? If yes, physical bleeding damage. Brute force, sure, recommended, but you don't necessarily need to. If you really wanted, like I said, you could pull the Primal Bond, the Primal Spirit, the Briarthorn, Mogdragon's Pact. If you're going to run pets, please use Mogdragons. It's great. And then from Soldier, I would recommend, again, if you're using Primal Bond, I would recommend Blade Arc with Laceration, Cadence, Counter-Strike, which is a fairly good time as well. So maybe you use Field Command. There's all kinds. Obviously, you can't fit every single skill in here that you would possibly want. So this is the glorious thing about Grim Dawn. And even as I'm talking through these videos and you're listening / watching them, I kind of designed them to be at least somewhat listened to more than actually watched visually. But you can always see your way to some alteration. Just because I would play, for example, let me say this. Let me actually use Primal Bond as an example, because this is one of my favorites for this combination. So let's say I personally was going to run a Primal Bond build, and I went absolutely gung-ho. I went full-on pets. Boosted all these pets. Okay, great. Now, I decided I wanted to use Blade Arc, Laceration, and I wanted Counter-Strike. Yeah, Counter-Strike and Menhir's Will for kicks. And then I splash in some Decorated Soldier. Now, I could play this, sure, but maybe you want to drop Laceration and Blade Arc for Cadence, which is perfectly viable. Absolutely fantastic. This absolutely can work. Maybe you want to drop Menhir's Will for the benefits of Cadence. You throw all your points into Cadence here. You have yourself a magical time, and you slap your remaining 6 points into Decorated Soldier. You could absolutely do this, or maybe, possibly, you don't want to do the retaliation damage. You want the survivability of Menhir's Will. You can do that too. Maybe you don't want Decorated Soldier, you're doing all the damage you need, you want Military Conditioning for that extra health. Sure, you can do that too. But you can see where there's all different kinds of ways, and again, while there are some skills that for each combination that I recommend you at least consider because of their complete utility. For this combination, which would be Decorated Soldier, which would be Menhir's Will, and which would be Brute Force. But you are absolutely free to go in any direction you want. It's absolutely amazing, and that's really what I think is fantastic about Grim Dawn, is that even as you see me talk and play about Grim Dawn and how I approach builds, do not let that for a hot second lock you into any kind of combination. I've just shown you 3 different ways, 4 different ways, 5 different ways of running a Primal Bond centric build. This is what I would call a directed improv. where I'm trying to go for some rough concept. But you can absolutely play it differently. You may use different skills you've never tried before because you think they would work, or because a piece of equipment makes that skill work with Primal Bond better, or what have you. There are all kinds of ways you can approach any of these, and that's what's fantastic. Now, again, if you're going to be busting out the lightning or the vitality damage on this combination, then you are going to be kind of using the soldier for the passive skills. This is generally why a lot of really popular soldier combinations exist, why a lot of people like soldier. Soldier technically works with every class because even if you don't need the soldier's damaging abilities, the passives are always really nice. Menhir's Will, military conditioning, always a good time. Veterancy, Scars of Battle, always fantastic abilities. Now there is actually, and this is going to surprise a ton of you, but there is one ability that I would also at least give some consideration to, maybe even more than a lot of the other ones. Markovian's Advantage. Most of these builds are doing physical damage, but it's that random plus 125% all damage. This works surprisingly well with Savagery. Once you get that full charge here, and let's say you're using a two-handed weapon, so you're even doing an 18% additional damage, slap this on here or whatever, and then we're doing additional physical damage, you can see the absolutely insane amounts of physical damage that you can do, plus, this is of course charge levels, so once you hit max charge level, Markovian's Advantage is going to hit like an absolute series of freight trains to your enemy. And this is one of the few builds I will actually actively encourage people to utilize Markovian's Advantage. Normally, the inconsistency of its activation is sketchy, but when it does activate with Savagery, it is such a massively damaging blow that often its inconsistency is made up for by the sheer amounts of damage that you can put out with that thing. Furthermore, you may also have noticed that Storm Touch provides some lightning retaliation, while that's the interesting thing here is, if you wanted to go with a retaliation build, which you, by the way, absolutely can, of course you can, it's the soldier, you could absolutely go with this. I don't often do when I'm going with a retaliation build, but you are going to do a really interesting mix of damage outputs, kind of. You could do Grasping Vines. That's not a bad thing, because retaliation damage is added to attack, so it can work. You've got your physical in there that you can boost, and you've got, of course, your Counter-Strike, which does physical and bleeding, so that's always a good time. You don't need to, but it's a fairly fun play. It is a fairly fun time to run a lightning physical retaliation setup. It is very interesting. But this is a very, how do I put this? Out of all of the combinations that I've examined so far in this series, this is the one that I will say is the most hit or miss. It's high risk, high reward. Either you either get or have the items you need to really make this pop off and absolutely decimate everything that stands in your way, or you don't have what you need and you just kind of die. And by what you need, I'm not talking about even those artifacts and items that are specific to this combination. Even semi-decent armor will help this build work the way it needs to. That's not really what I'm saying here. The ultimate point here is that, hey, if I can get this stuff going, then I can really absolutely slap. Now, this will also be one of those combinations that you will see me play a lot. Not necessarily because it's, strictly speaking, my favorite. It is one of my favorites. It is not my absolute most favorite. but the sheer diversity of weird things you can do with this build, effectively, is unending. I'm still to this day still finding really fascinating builds that work pretty well with this thing, that I can play around with whenever. So, if you feel like you want to experiment with your own style of build, this is a great place to experiment with. Just make sure you have the resources set aside that you can burn to experiment with this, because there is a very real possibility that if you experiment with some combination of skills you hate, you will have to respec, at least partially, if not totally, depending on how far gone the build is. So, if you want to practice build crafting, this is the combination to start with. There's just so much weird things you can do with this, especially when you start involving items specific to this combination, that then it becomes quite a different field. You have even more things that you can play around and experiment with, even more alterations that you can get involved with. I'm just talking about this combination experimentally from the point of view of no items, but you yourself obviously will at some point be incorporating conversations and questions about specific items to this specific combo, to the warder. And that's really where the fun really gets started with builds. And you will see, as I work my way towards Ultimate again with this character, that I can effectively do all kinds of fun, wacky things with this. I probably will wait until I can do a focused build with this combination before I play it for you viewers at home or wherever you are. But it is a lot of fun to actually experiment with. Besides that, there are some skills you probably really won't be playing too much around with in this build. Generally speaking, a lot of the vitality damage you aren't going to be messing with, because sure, Wendigo Totem does in fact eventually start doing bleeding damage, which is nice and all, but, and don't get me wrong, Wendigo Totem is incredibly powerful. But if you're going with, say, Primal Bond, there are better things you can use. Now, you still can use Wendigo Totem, and that's something that, actually, I'm gonna put it this way. There's a lot of abilities that can work with each other decently well, but without specific items without specific combinations of things, both skills and items, you're never going to reach complete seamlessness. There's always going to be that little bit of, I'm not really sure that really works here. In one case in point, actually, the one ability I would say steer clear of in all situations would be the Wind Devil, because it reduces elemental resistance at some point in its future, right there. And yes, it does do lightning damage, it does cold damage. It does cold damage. There's not really a whole lot you can do with that elemental resistance, personally. If you're playing with friends, maybe it's worth it. Maybe your friend's doing a lot of elemental damage. Perhaps then it would be worth going into Stormcaller's Pact and investing some points into the Wind Devil. Maybe. But ultimately, the problem really is that it doesn't really do a whole lot specifically for any of the builds I've talked about so far. Because even if you're using Savagery, it would be better to skip out on this and go into, say, Storm Totem and put points in Stormcaller's Pact and Primal Strike, and maybe even Menhir's Will, depending on what you're already using and what you're already playing with, because these basically exist to reduce the accuracy of ranged enemies, do some cold damage, do some lightning damage, reduce the enemy's elemental damage. And if you're only doing... It's the only source of cold damage, the only non-equipment source of cold damage in this combination, that the elemental portion of the deal is practically useless, unless you're going into the Discord version of Cadence, which, honestly, if you're using this combination, why, first off? But anyways, there probably is a couple of applications with specific items that I'm just not remembering right now off the top of my head, but I would broadly steer clear of Wind Devil. It's very rarely going to be useful to you. Again, if you're playing with teammates who do a pretty strong amount of elemental damage, that's a bit of a different conversation. But at that point, again, instead of doing that, you could go into a Primal Bond build, be more effective yourself individually, and grab Emboldening Presence and boost the damage of your allies directly, as well as the retaliation damage and their resistances. There are just a lot of better alternatives in this particular combination than Wind Devil. That's just my hot take on the Wind Devils. For this combination, personally, I also, when I play this combination, I don't usually go into Devouring Swarm, because I don't often need the Vitality and Bleeding Resistance drop from this. Sometimes I'll build it with a Primal Bond build, sometimes I won't. It really depends on what I've got, and where the build overall is heading, and if I have the points to spare. But it's not often, not necessarily because it cannot or does not work, it's just that it's not as vitally important as some of the things can or might be to your build in future, depending on what equipment you have and the overall direction of your build. So with that being said, with this combination, mostly because I talked about experimenting, which is mostly what I do with this class combination. It's fairly straightforward otherwise, honestly, as you probably figured out from at least third of this video. But thank you all very much for joining me. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, ideas, or suggestions, please leave them down in the comments below. I do read them. Thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.